Welcome to the 9th Summer Solstice series from First Presbyterian Church, Salina. I'm Martha Ray, the co-coordinator of the series with Sydney Soderberg. This year's Summer Solstice looks at the aftertime of our year of COVID, with its separating lockdowns and paralyzing political polarity. How do we move forward? How do we open to our new normal? How do we begin to actively and intentionally heal, both individually and in community? Bringing together speakers from across the country, as well as a few more local favorites, we explore this year's theme, Moving to Higher Ground, the Need for Healing. Today is the third and final session of the series, Communal Practice as a Response for Healing. It is moderated by Dr. Paula Fried. Paula is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Salina for many years. During this time, she has also been involved in numerous and varied community projects, often in a leadership capacity. And on a personal note, she is a seasoned cook whose culinary skills are enjoyed widely. She is actively interested in supporting local producers as well. Today's panel members are Dr. William Doherty, Dr. Maureen Morrison, and Isaiah Oliver. They will be introduced by Dr. Fried. And finally, do remember that there are two options for participation in this year's series, online and in person. Visit the church's website at fpcsalina.org to learn more about that. So thank you for joining us. And now, Dr. Fried.
Welcome to the third session in the 2021 Summer Solstice series, Moving to Higher Ground, Practices for Healing. This theme was chosen in response to the forces of isolation and polarization that have been intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic and heightened by the last presidential election. These twin forces of isolation and polarization have reinforced old divisions and revealed new ones, creating fatigue, anxiety, uncertainty, and fear for many people. We may feel uneasy, even in our own homes, among friends, at work, and in our institutions when contested issues come up, like politics or even vaccinations. Throughout this series, we've explored how we can move forward together, how we might work to actively and intentionally heal, individually and collectively. Today, our conversation continues, animated by questions like, how will we knit together the tears the past year has created or revealed? How will we repair the ruptures that are newly created, as well as the ones that have long been with us, previously ignored or denied? How will we create family and community processes that enable us to tell our separate stories together, building relationships that foster connection while honoring differences? Today, in our final session, we are very fortunate to be joined by three people who are each working at different meeting points where these kinds of conflicts, concerns, and yearnings come together. We will have a chance to get a glimpse of what is in each of their toolboxes and hear what they have learned about healing and resilience. I am delighted to introduce our three panelists. Dr. Maureen Morrison is a psychologist in private practice in Wichita, Kansas, providing psychotherapy for individuals and couples. Described by her peers as the therapist's therapist, Maureen is known for her sensitivity, her intellect, and her clarity of thought. Her undergraduate major was an integration of psychology, philosophy, and religion. She says that her grounding in these three disciplines has been helpful in navigating the pandemic, enabling her to draw upon resources from all three schools of thought. Her faith is a deep resource for her personally and informs her thoughtful and generous way of moving through the world. In the past year, she's worked with many clients struggling with ruptures in their families and with friends, created by different views of politics in the pandemic. Maureen's hope is that the work she does will help people be more confident and skillful in navigating differences in their families and out in their communities. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you, Paula, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Maureen, and I'm going to keep going just a little bit more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to introduce everyone else and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Isaiah Oliver is the president and CEO of the Community Foundation of Flint, Michigan. He is the youngest and first Black CEO of the Community Foundation in Flint, and is known as a bridge builder and for his commitment to amplifying local voices and the concerns of the community. A Flint native, he is deeply involved in the community and has extended the reach of his work at the Community Foundation to provide leadership around the Flint water crisis, literacy rates, healthy food access, and responding to the racially disparate impacts of COVID-19. In 2017, the Community Foundation of Greater Flint was one of 14 organizations in the country to receive funding to pilot the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation program developed by the Kellogg Foundation. Isaiah says that it is a privilege to be held accountable by so many. His 26-member board of directors, donors, and stakeholders at the Community Foundation, and also to the faith community that helped rear him and his family that continues to support him. Being beholden to so many helps him be a bolder leader. Welcome, Isaiah.
Thank you so much for having me.
So glad you're here. Dr. William Doherty is a professor of family social science and director of the Citizen Professional Center at the University of Minnesota. He is also a practicing marriage and family therapist. He is known for his work with couples struggling with divorce decisions and has written numerous books on marriage and parenting and has been recognized nationally for his work. Shortly after the 2016 election, he and two colleagues launched an organization called Braver Angels, using marital therapy techniques to reduce political polarization and increase understanding among partisan individuals. Braver Angels has conducted over 1,000 workshops across the country in the past 4 years, helping participants move from hatred or disdain to respect and appreciation for political adversaries. Bill says that his experience in moving so far outside his personal comfort zone and meeting so many people with a different view of the world has left him more hopeful that his fellow citizens, if offered the right container for conversation, will choose to access the better angels of their nature. Welcome, Bill.
Sure.
And Maureen, I'd like you to get us started by telling us a little bit about you and your work.
Thank you, Paula, for that kind introduction. I spend several days a week sitting in a quiet therapy office with people from all walks of life who are struggling with the complicated realities of being human and trying to understand their life story with fresh eyes. Every hour, as we talk, we move between the mundane and the profound. And most days I walk away feeling honored to have been witness to deep suffering, amazing resilience, and the potential for change that marks our existence. I believe that change always starts small, and my work is not directly related to community activism or change within large groups like it is for Isaiah and Bill. But I firmly believe that starting with families, couples, and the individual plants seeds. Most importantly, therapy can give people an experiential knowing that they are capable of change and that they can be pioneers of change and lead the way forward in larger systems. As Paula mentioned, my undergraduate work and having a major that included philosophy and religion as well as psychology always informs my therapeutic work. And I think we live in a chronically anxious culture, and many families are chronically anxious. The pandemic and the political polarization of the past 2 years has amplified that anxiety. And unfortunately, at times, I think it became a handy distraction. And when I say that, I'm not trying to minimize the impact of the pandemic or the political divide, but rather I'd like to suggest that perhaps some of our methods of coping with both allowed us to dodge a core existential dilemma, which is death anxiety. Research over the years has shown that we use our culture and belief systems to psychologically buffer against death anxiety. And when those beliefs are challenged, we often prefer to attack those with opposing viewpoints rather than re-examine our own. So politics, science related to the pandemic, and the boundaries of freedom in a culture all became flashpoints. Many of my sessions with patients this year focused on a 2-level therapeutic approach. We would discuss practical ways of maintaining connections with others, limiting social media exposure, and looking for some of the positives and the benefits related to the lockdown. For some, the intensity of their anxiety forced them to try new coping methods, such as a mindfulness practice or journaling, to help them stay tuned into their bodies and their emotions. For some people, it was simply a long overdue rest where they could read, they could garden, or they could learn how to bake bread. We often explore the reality that our sense of invulnerability and safety and control was always based on an illusion, and that the pandemic was simply an in-our-face reminder that none of us were able to escape these realities. Confronting this truth led some people to begin to question why they were living the way they were. They began to explore their job situation, their marriages, and dreams that they have deferred. And they decided to live with more intentionality. New chapters were written, and some began to compose their life rather than passively accepting the givens of their day-to-day existence. I often shared this quote from an Israeli entrepreneur and influencer named Inbal Arieli. She says, "If life is naturally disorganized, wouldn't developing the skills necessary to deal with its unpredictability be more effective than trying to create order?" So perhaps we need to let go of the illusion of order and control and instead develop our mastery muscles and resilience. The second level that we would work on goes deeper below the surface. When people would get distracted by the thrill or the agony, depending on your viewpoint, of debating politics or the proper pandemic response, I tried to coach them through that with the following questions. Number one, why is it so important to you to prove that you are right? Number two, what is it costing your relationship with this person to continue to be angry and frustrated with them? Number three, what are you afraid will happen if you cannot convince them of your truth? Number four, is there anxiety of any type underneath your anger that they will perhaps die or get sick? And number five, how would it feel for you if they did indeed die? Instead of avoiding death anxiety, I tried to help them walk through it. As the theologian Martin Buber would say, I invited them to consider an I-thou relationship rather than an I-it relationship. In the latter, you are trying to manage the it, and humanity is reduced for both of you. You are trapped in the role of expert, and they are reduced to a dependent in need of being managed. The I-thou relationship, however, uses human emotions and needs as a pathway for connecting to each other and opens hearts for increased understanding. It allows for mystery, uncertainty, and more tolerance for discomfort of all kinds. Existential anxiety and garden variety anxiety may still be present, but they are confronted within relationship. We cannot escape all suffering, but at times we can do it less alone. Thank you, Paula.
Well, Maureen, thank you for that wonderful introduction to your work. Isaiah, I'd like you to go next and tell us about you and your work.
Well, I look forward to talking just a little bit about my work, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to say, as a logic-driven pragmatist, self-proclaimed logic-driven pragmatist who believes that leadership is the art of disappointing your people at a rate they can absorb, I need to spend more time talking to Maureen. Again, my name is Isaiah Oliver. I serve as president and CEO at the Community Foundation of Greater Flint. And many people will say, what does that mean? For me, that means I lead an organization focused on engaging people in the world of philanthropy, giving their time and their talent and their treasure to make the community they love a better place to live in and work in and contribute to. And as a result of that work, I get to work across the aisle with a number of people from different backgrounds. We have, again, 26 trustees, 21 staff members, 468 volunteers, 31,000 donors who've contributed to over 700 unique funds. And so the work is not only diverse, but the pool of folks that work comes from is also diverse. And so it should show up in the work that we do externally. As stated earlier, I was hired as president and CEO back in 2017. And at the time, we were at the very tail end of a water crisis in Flint. And Flint is known for a lot of things. It's known for being a majority minority city. It's known for being Black. It's known for being poor. Our poverty rate for children is 60%. Our poverty rate for our residents is 40%. is known for General Motors and what it means for big corporations like that to move to these smaller organizations isolated across the country. But we're also known for a water crisis that exposed 10,000 kids between 0 and 6, 100,000 residents to poison in their drinking water. And our response to that work not only shows how resilient our community is, but quite frankly, it explains or shares how thoughtful we are about moving forward. And so if you know anything about the water crisis, it started to near a bookend around the time that we started to deal with a global health pandemic. And everyone was sent home to work. And not only the issues that were happening around unemployment or thinking about how we respond to the COVID pandemic, but we also had, again, political polarization. We had an economic downturn and a number of issues really compounding on one another. And as a community foundation, again, centered on making sure that we have a community where everyone can live and communicate and thrive and contribute, we had to figure out what we did with the charity that we were giving out. We are a very generous community. We're a $277 million community foundation by way of assets. We give away about $13 million a year. But we had to realize that one, charity wasn't enough. And we had to dig deeper into our bag of sharing and collecting data, our bag of amplifying resident voices, our bag of education and advocacy and lobbying appropriate to larger pools of dollars from the state or federal government. What did it mean to marshal resources from organizations that were not state and federal government, but they were other types of philanthropy or other types of giving instruments? And then what did it mean for us to convene, to bring together multi-sector partners to address what we know have been a collection of multi-sector issues? And one platform that we use to really rally our community and rally our community stakeholders was this idea of truth, racial healing, and transformation. So we were awarded alongside 14 communities across the country by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a grant to center TRHT, as I'll call it throughout the rest of this, a process or a framework that will allow us to really explore the many issues that exist across our country and how our community might use healing as a way or a pathway forward. Truth, as stated here, and if you think about TRHT, it comes out of this long line of about 40 different truth and reconciliation projects that have existed all over the world, in Canada and South Africa, but we never done that work right here in America. I'm acknowledging that we needed to figure out what reconciliation looked like in the context of American history, but also being thoughtful that we needed to call everyone to something. So again, truth, racial healing, and transformation started for us in 2017. And if I were to take just a quick minute to say, that was a struggle for me. I came, as Paula shared earlier, I came in as the youngest, the first Black, and the only community foundation president for the community for Genesee County or the greater Flint area that was from the greater Flint area. And so I didn't want to be known as the Black president. I wanted to be known as the Community Foundation, the Greater Flint president, who happened to have some lived experiences that included being younger than his predecessors, that included being Black, that included being born and raised on the north side of Flint, that was code for all of those things that I described before, including seeing the violence of Flint streets outside of your bedroom window and out on the 6 o'clock news, right? I wanted to be known for being more than just the Black president. And so this Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation project landed in my lap. And for the first 5 times, I fought it. This isn't what I want to do. We've got plenty of work to do. We've got lots of grant making, many stakeholders from across Genesee County who don't happen to be Black that I have to engage with in the most authentic way. And when I learned more about this framework, I understood how we could use this framework to center our work and using equity as a tool, but not a weapon. And we really could move the work forward. Wherefore, again, we start with the idea of truth and really exploring or interrogating the truth, the racial history, really wrestling with the racial history of our country, the racial history of our local community, and how from the settlements in Jamestown across to the 49ers or to San Francisco, what does it mean for our community or for our country to colonize across the country? And what did that mean for the folks who were there? Folks who were there before, the folks who were engaged in the labor, the folks that were exploited, and how does that play out in the local context? And if we aren't willing to wrestle with that, then we're not identifying and removing the barriers that are necessary for our community or for our nation to naturally heal. And so we move to this racial healing process. It's really a debiasing process. It's really looking at individuals and saying, hey, what makes you human? How do we jettison or get rid of forever this belief in the hierarchy of human value? And how do we start to level set how we engage with one another when we're talking about controversial issues like political polarization or race by saying, hey, when was the last time you laughed out loud? When was the last time you felt heard? When was the last time someone listened to you? and it mattered? When was the last time someone made you smile really big? When is the last time you cried really hard? And it really makes us center the human experience that we all have. That way, when we start having those tougher conversations about community redlining, we start having those conversations about whether or not there's a hierarchy in organizational order or organizational value, or the access to leadership pipeline development for Black and Latinos. When we start having those tough conversations about who gets to stay home and what does equity really mean? What does it mean to give every individual in your organization what they need to live into the assignment that they have there? When we start having those tough conversations, we can lean back to those things that make us all human. And then finally, we start talking about this world of transformation. In most cases, you will hear folks say reconciliation, but we would believe that that's built on a false premise. We believe that's built on the premise that we were ever in this country all on the same footing. We were all in the same conversation around the same table harmoniously. That for us is a false premise. But this idea of co-creating a future where everyone can contribute equitably to it is the place that we want to live. So what does it mean to transform this community to be a place, again, where everyone can live in and work in and contribute to? That's been the framework that we work within. That includes a lot of narrative change, and it includes 3 pillars. This pillar of separation, those things in our community that continue to separate us, whether it be where we live, where we access education, or how we get health benefits. We talk about law, and that can include judges and police, but really those folks and really thinking about fair application of laws and practices. And then the last one is the economy. And it's not just about business banking and workforce development. It's about the exploitation of poverty and how that plays out in a community like ours, and how it's playing out across our country, and how that lives into that racial healing history that we described earlier. That has been the centering of our work, and we found ways to talk about literacy and access to healthy food and building neighborhoods and being thoughtful about our response to disparities in the numbers or inequities in systems that perpetuate those disparities related to COVID vaccines or access to testing. And we've utilized that framework as a way to engage people and figure out not only where we are, but what we need to compromise about where we are to get where we're trying to go. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have, but that's just a snapshot into the work that we've been doing right here in the city of Flint. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. Great. Okay, Bill.
Well, it's great to follow. A kind of a look inside, the office. Maureen's intensive work with individuals and couples and families, and Isaiah's vision and work with a larger community. And so I'm sort of both in a way. My background is as a marriage and family therapist and an academic, and I've done a lot of community engagement work over the years, but never was involved in political polarization until mid-November of 2016. I assume we all remember the election of 2016. Raise your hand. Sitting at this very desk, I got a phone call from a colleague of mine, David Blankenhorn from New York City, who had been on the phone with another colleague of ours from Southwest Ohio, talking about how people were feeling about the election in those 2 areas. Well, if you know Upper East Side of Manhattan, you can imagine it was a funeral after the election of President Trump. And in Southwest Ohio, it was hope and change, practically dancing in the street. And they decided impulsively during their call to get 10 Hillary Clinton voters and 10 Donald Trump voters together for 13 hours over a weekend in Southwest Ohio in December, and called me. And I said, well, that's pretty brave. What were you thinking of doing with them? And they said they didn't know, but they thought maybe I could figure out something. And I remember looking at my book, I saw one of these old calendars, hoping I was not free that week. Oh, too bad. I have a wedding to go to or something, but I was free. And so I just plunged in, and we had a remarkable experience with those 20 people. When we asked them why they came, they said this rancor is keeping them from having a community. Isaiah, thinking about what you talked about with Flint, they were saying we have schools to run and hospitals to take care of, and we have children to raise here. And we're fighting each other all the time. We're hating each other, and it can't work. And so it was an amazing experience, and I thought it'd be a one-off, a great story, to tell, but the group didn't want to stop. And so I flew back, cashed in another frequent flyer ticket, and flew back to South Lebanon, Ohio, And we decided to keep it going and to begin to develop this and create a leadership cadre. And so out of that came this this work of Braver Angels that is really about bringing reds and blues together. Reds, people are more conservative, tend to vote Republican. Blues, more liberal, tend to vote more for Democrats. Bringing reds and blues together for the common purpose of healing, of depolarizing, of figuring out how we can have a country together. A key principle right from the beginning was that the leadership is half red, half blue. The board, all of the leaders, state coordinators, everything. And so this has been an experience for me of continually relating to people who are different from me politically. And it's interesting, I've had many more experiences of relating to people different from me racially and ethnically, but not politically. I mean, we can get into silos where the political other is the one we don't relate to, but we can relate to somebody perhaps who differs from us in other ways, religiously or racially or so on, as long as they're either liberal or conservative. So it's been quite a journey. And what we've done is created a whole series of workshop experiences, skills training. We have debates, big debate series. And the thing is, going back to what Isaiah was saying, we sort of decided that we were going to tackle difficult issues and not skirt them. And in doing that, sometimes we lose members. So we'll have a debate resolution that will say, resolve that the election was stolen. Or the next one is resolve the police should be defunded. And then you lose some people on each of those, because in our country today, people think we shouldn't even have the conversation. To have the conversation is inherently wrong. And so we're committed to having the conversation, even if it makes us difficult, it makes us uneasy. And for me, then it's increased my hope that that we can, if we're honest with each other and we create structures, processes, containers, like therapy, Maureen, you create a container in the room for people. And I say this truth and reconciliation, it sounds like it's a very beautiful container for the conversation. And that's what we do. We create containers, processes for people to come together and learn to understand each other beyond stereotypes and look for common ground. And I'll end with two experiences I've had in the last month. We now have a Families Divided webinar, and I did the first one a week ago, where this was a married couple who volunteered to be interviewed by me about their political differences and how that affects the relationship in front of a big audience, off screen. And then to have a reflecting team, and Maureen, you may know this from the therapy world, a reflecting team, 2 reds and 2 blues, who listened to the interview and express what they learned from it and their appreciation for the couple. So it's a beautiful experience. And then last week in Washington, D.C., so that's the micro experience. Last week in Washington, D.C., I testified to the Joint House Committee on the Modernization of Congress. It's 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and they're now taking up what they said is their hardest issue, and that is polarization in Congress. So I had a chance to meet with those folks, and it wasn't just a 5-minute testimony a number of us gave. They did something that may have been the first time in the history of Congress. They created a roundtable, and they had informal conversation. They were open, they were vulnerable. They talked about how hard it is to work in Congress, and I think really some really good things that come out of that. So I had these experiences of heart to heart with a couple who are divided politically, and then a heart-to-heart experience with members of Congress, and that's on the record. And I believe that if we create the right containers, we can have those conversations. My 2 colleagues here, Maureen and Isaiah, are talking about that, and that's what I'm trying to do in this Braver Angels world. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And so I want to follow up with you, Bill, and go a little further with this last idea about the container. And I know you've said in other places that we are wired for connection. That's just part of our human makeup. And that when we feel safe with other people, that natural inclination will emerge. So if we create the right conditions, in other words. And so I'm wondering, and Maureen and Isaiah, I'm sure you can weigh in on this too, if you would like, but Bill, what have you learned about creating safety through Braver Angels? What does that look like?
Well, to give an example, in our what we call Red Blue workshop, we use a process that encourages listening to others rather than being prepared to argue back. And a number of folks may be familiar with this. It's a simple technique that's been used for decades called a fishbowl. We flip a coin and we say, who are the reds or the blues going to go into a middle circle first? So middle circle, and then the other group is in an outer circle. When you're in the outer circle, your job is to listen and learn something about how the people in the middle experience the world. Okay. You don't respond, you don't verbally or non-verbally. And then in the people in the circle, answer two questions. Why are your side's values and policies good for the country? And what are your reservations or concerns about your own side? Why are your side's values and policies good for the country? What are your reservations and concerns? And then the two sides switch. So the inner circle goes out and the outer circle goes in. And then afterwards, they pair up, and then they have a whole group conversation around these two questions. What did you learn about how the other side sees themselves? And did you see anything in common? What did you learn about how they see themselves? And did you see anything in common? So that's a container. And then we train the moderators to hold people to the container. Those are the only questions you can answer then. This is not the time to refute the other side or argue about the other side. This is a chance to express yourself, not compare yourself to others, and to listen deeply. And it's really powerful. And so it's not rocket science. You know, I didn't invent this, but when you create that process in that container and people are willing to have goodwill to enter it, there are revelations that occur.
Thank you. Isaiah, do you want to add anything to that? I know you've talked about not necessarily trying to create comfortable spaces, but rather create compassionate spaces.
Yeah, and I think that comes from this idea of listening deeply. So I appreciate everything Bill just shared. I think the writer Douglas Steer says to listen another soul into life into a condition of disclosure and discovery may almost be one of the greatest services any human being can offer to another. And that's real. I mean, you got to listen to the words, to the feelings beneath the words. You got to listen to yourself as well, which is something that I thought Bill didn't talk into, really thinking about striving to achieve this balance between listening, reflecting, speaking, and acting. And that space also includes this idea of understanding the biases that we bring to every conversation that we're in. And so we're thoughtful about maybe identifying the assumptions, those judgments that, those judgments, I would say, and reactions that undergird our worldview, the way we see the world around us, the way we engage and interact with the world around us. If we can identify those assumptions in between speaking and listening, I think it really creates for a richer, deeper conversation and a better understanding of the perspectives that are being brought to the circle that we've created.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was just thinking about a young man I worked with this past year. He was about 20 years old, and he was on the very liberal end of things in terms of his political viewpoints. And he was very invested in convincing his mom, and she was, I'd say, moderately conservative, but he was so frustrated that he could not convince her of his viewpoint. And I mean, he spent a lot of energy on this, and he'd read all kinds of stuff online. And we finally figured out that he was making the assumption that if he could just get her to watch the right news or read the right articles or read this book that he just read, that then she would kind of see the light and it would make sense to her. And so I suggested to him to ask her about how did she get to her viewpoint? You know, what was her journey? What was her background? Why does her viewpoint make sense to her? And of course, that opened up some things about her life story and introduced some of her feelings and expectations of the future. And that totally shifted things for him. But anyway, it just the things that both of you were talking about, that just reminded me of that example.
You know what, Maureen, I hope you don't mind me jumping in here, but I
Sure,
think I think that's a moment that we're in. We've seen this moment play out year over year. I think there's one thing about creating these compassionate spaces where we can engage with one another, but there are also those natural containers that are created that we can't avoid. And we know back in the 60s, where I wasn't around, right? But back in the 60s, people were watching things happen on TV that they'd heard about, but they never seen before. Right. And they had to have a conversation at home with their mom and dad about what they were seeing. And so you can't avoid that container. So now you got to wrestle with the tough issues. And again, because of social media, we're at home. Everyone's at home because majority of folks are working from home. We're isolated in our COVID caves, really. But social media drops some political polarization. It drops some racial tensions, including the murder of George Floyd, right in our homes. Right. And kids and parents had to have those conversations, and that container was created. They've already created the safe space in their home in most cases. And so they were building on that by having conversations about things that were happening across the country. And again, these are other natural containers that are created for real conversations that have to happen, and we're not able to avoid it. And I think that's just another moment. If we go all the way back to just post-Civil War, there was another moment where folks were doing speeches. And so you got your W.B. Du Bois kind of doing the Frederick Douglasses of the world, doing speeches. People are going home to have those conversations with people that they love, people that they care about, people that they trust. And so now what do we do with these trusted spaces and the conversations that are happening? I think that's showing up in the way that we're engaging with the world around us.
Yeah. I love that term, natural container.
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, this, because I speak as a family therapist, one of our workshops is on families and politics. And one of the challenges for families in these discussions, Maureen, you were referring to this, is how do we tolerate differences within the family?
Right.
How do I let you come to your conclusions? I share my truth, you share yours. And what can happen is that families divide. I've seen people threatening divorces over who they voted for this time. I've seen family cutoffs. So I've been consulting with families who have split over politics. And Maureen, in our workshop, we talk about the prime directive, out of Star Trek, is don't try to change another family member.
Yes.
You can only change yourself.
Yes.
Because family members, and just think about COVID. You try to tell a family member they have to get the vaccine. And if you get yourself completely agitated and worked up over the fact that they're not getting the vaccine, they will rather die than get that darn vaccine. So these are natural spaces, and they also have their own challenges to be navigated.
Yes. I want to follow up on this idea of the capacity for change. And that, like Maureen, you saw with your client, that his perspective after talking to his mom helped him understand not only her better, but I'm guessing he saw a shift occur in himself.
Right.
Well,
right.
And Bill, I watched the documentary made about Braver Angels, which I highly recommend to all of you. And one thing that struck me, and I'm curious if you think the same way, that it seemed like for many participants, not only or as much as they came to see the other side differently, they came to see themselves differently. And they were kind of inspired almost by their capacity to shift in a way that they had not expected would happen before the workshop. And I'm wondering, do you see it that way? And if you do, is recognizing and reflecting on one's own capacity for growth, is that important to build into all of these kinds of healing conversations? And if so, how do we foster that, facilitate that?
Great question. I think it has to be discovered rather than prescribed. So Isaiah, when you talked about the questioning of assumptions, that happens in these workshops. We don't tell people that that's going to happen. We don't program them for it. But it's a part of it is a de-stereotyping. We have so many stereotypes of people we don't know. And when we see them as human beings with complexity, when we see people on the other side as very diverse, not monolithic. I mean, there's this human tendency to see people in our own sphere as very diverse and people other than us as more monolithic. And then people, they do realize that they have shifted. That in a direction of more complexity, and that's a powerful thing. What I don't believe in is, though, putting people in a situation where we tell them that's what you have to do. They have to come to it.
So I think, and I hate to loop us back to listening deeply, but I think Bill just brought up a really good point around that. I think we have to create this space by suspending judgment, by creating space between judgment and the reactions that come as a result. And it's not for the person that you're listening to. I think by fully listening to the folks around you, you really create a space where you more fully explore your own biases, who you are and how you got to where you are. And I think as you create that space, one thing that I ask people to do, and we typically do in our circles, is say when things get difficult, turn to wonder as opposed to turning to judgment. I wonder how this person got to this place.
Exactly.
I wonder what centers they're thinking in here. I wonder what lived experiences kind of transform where they are, how they got to where they are and where they're going, and really exploring the wonder as opposed to the judgment that we may move to immediately. So creating that space between, also, again, thanks to Bill for bringing this in, really requires us really listening deeply to the folks that are around.
That's a great point. And to go back to the example I was giving, the young man, after he'd had the conversation with his mom at our next session, he said, I asked him how it went and everything. And I said, well, what kinds of feelings came up for you and all that. And he said, I was very humbled the more I learned about her and the more I learned about why she believes what she does believe. I still don't agree with her on some things, but it makes more sense to me. And the change in him was that he moved away from being a 20-year-old who thinks he knows everything. And he became more humble and more open to the mystery of who his mom is. So yeah, that absolutely happens for people. And it's so fun to watch and be a part of.
I love that that directive to move into a space of wonder, because just saying don't be judgmental doesn't do it. What do I do when I'm not being judgmental?
Yeah.
One of the I did a workshop for congressional staff members of a Republican and a Democrat, and we began that workshop with a question, and Brave Rangers would like to ask, what life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and the public good? And everybody gets several minutes to take notes and reflect on that, and then everyone gets 5 minutes uninterrupted to tell some stories about your life and how that's influenced. And then afterwards, when everybody gets their time, then we can reflect back. So that encourages the listening and it encourages the kind of introspection that making connections. I mean, that's what you in therapy, Maureen, and that's what you're saying, making connections inside, connections inside. And we do that when we make connections outside.
Wonderful. Maureen, go ahead. Is there something else?
I came across, and now I can't remember off the top of my head where I read it, but a couple days ago in an article, this great phrase, and it was talking about polarization politically, and it was saying that we've gotten to a place where on both sides, compromise is viewed as catastrophic. So people aren't aware of that, but they're going into these discussions with compromise is just like off the table, because if we do, that's apocalyptic. And so it made me think of it when you said, Bill, you don't tell people, well, we're going to help you learn how to compromise. It's not that overt, but that's where they end up when they go through a process like this, is that there is more openness to compromise, and they now understand that, no, maybe it's not catastrophic. So it becomes an option again.
I'd like to go a little further with some of the resistance that sometimes people bring to these conversations. And in the course of preparing for these summer solstice conversations, I've been talking with lots of family and friends. And one person said to me, I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my indignation, which I thought was such a lovely and honest statement, of how delicious righteous indignation can feel, and how hard it is to set it aside. Or another person said to me, I know I need to bring my best self. I know that's just sort of a basic act of integrity, but it's so hard to bring my best self to a conversation with someone I know that doesn't respect me, or someone I love dearly. And I'm wondering, how do all of you deal with that? How do each of you deal with that, running into those pockets of resistance that we all carry? Isaiah, does anything come to mind?
So I'm thinking about two different types of responses, right? There's an emotional response to it that we've been talking about. What does it mean to listen deeply? What does it mean to move away from judgment and toward wonder? What does it mean to kind of allow people the space to speak their truth while also maintaining a level of confidentiality to create space for respecting the content and the discussion and the circle that's been created? I think all of those are ways to manage the emotional response. But I think there's also a business case for many of the things that we're describing. And there's a question to ask. If everyone's happy with where we are, we're talking about polarization because we are on opposite ends of the spectrum, living in a democracy where no one will get 100% of what they want. But what does it mean to live in a civil society? What does it mean to live in a society where people have the resources they need to give their best and to get their best out of it? And I think that's a question that we have to wrestle with collectively. There is an isolation around whether or not we have a society that works for everyone and everyone has equality of opportunity in it. And I think that's something to wrestle with. And there's a business case for that. And that business case goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years around our thoughts around civil society and how it plays out. How do we dust off some of that and really explore what Plato, what was he saying? What was he thinking when he was talking about the civil society? What does it mean as we engage in these conversations about what we wanted to create in America that we didn't have in the country that we left? Right. I think those are conversations that we can have. And there's a business case for those that is a lot less emotional than many of the conversations that we're having right now or on our own personal lived experiences. How do we think back about the creation of a country that's been around doing this work for 400 odd years? How do we live into the potential of America in a way that works for every part, every piece of America?
I appreciate that. And Bill, that seems to reference back to what you were saying earlier about people's frustration that we're not working well as a community at this point. And we've got children to raise and schools to fund. And say more about that.
Yeah, it just to follow up what Isaiah was saying, what kind of world do we want to live in? In therapy, when a couple comes for therapy, they're unhappy in the relationship, and mostly they want the other person to change, right? And so you try to access their larger goal that we could do better. That in a marriage, nobody's happy unless both are. That's how I see it. And so ultimately, we can all get tired of dealing with people who are different. Okay, so the friends and family members you're talking about, Paul, it's sort of like, do I want to keep dealing with those folks? I understand that at an emotional level, and I never tell anybody you have to personally deal with folks. Okay, but if we collectively if we don't take on that task of building that kind of society that Isaiah was talking about, if we just retreat, the only things left are coercion and violence. Those are the only things left. And so it's inviting people to their broader goals for how we want to have families, how do we want to have communities. And because if we don't pitch in and deal with each other and talk to each other, coercion and violence are the only methods. And demagogues will come along and say, you're right to not talk to those folks, and we're going to crush them. We're going to crush them. And that's not a world that I think most of us want to live in.
To move that to sort of a micro or individual level, and to respond to your question, Paula, about the example you gave of the person who said that they really aren't ready to give up their righteous indignation. I think probably I would encounter that kind of resistance with questions like, what is it costing you to maintain that stance?
Mhm.
If you weren't feeling that way, what do you think you'd be feeling instead? But to get at the point of maintaining that stance, which in a way does violence to the relationship, that does have a cost. And so just maybe helping them explore that for themselves.
That's lovely.
So Maureen, do you mind if I follow up? Just
Sure,
I
absolutely.
appreciate that. And I think some of this is very personal. How do you allow people to suspend disbelief long enough? This disbelief that we could ever reach a middle ground. So I got to hold my space, my stake in the ground. How do you get people to suspend disbelief long enough that they can learn what they need to learn to fill the empathy gap needed to live into the good society? Because there's an empathy gap that exists, and we all know it. We've been describing it. But you've got to fill that empathy gap in order to move to a place where we co-create a future together. But that requires suspending some disbelief about the fact that we could ever get there, because we haven't lived in a world or a country where that has existed before. So we're really talking about hope and dreaming. That's what we're talking about. And how do you give people the blinders that they need to kind of really look forward and see the world in front of them and really live and dream into that future? Probably asked like 7 questions there. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great question. And I guess the way I would think about that is I would try to help them not by starting with developing empathy for the other person in their position, but I would try to help them tap into their own vulnerability. So that's why I ask questions about fear, what they're afraid of. And that's where if they can do that, if they can tap into and in a sense be empathetic toward themselves and be willing to tolerate the vulnerability, that often starts opening doors for them to then be more empathetic toward the other person. It creates sort of a tenderness or a softness in people that they're more willing, like you say, to suspend their position for just a moment.
Well, Maureen, thank you so much. And Paula, thanks for allowing me to co-moderate for a minute.
No,
that was a great question.
That's my greatest dream. So thank you that you're all asking these great questions. Bill, what do you think about that? What allows people to suspend all of their stuff enough to join in some kind of new experience?
I think what Paula, what Maureen said is a very insightful way to begin, because it doesn't work to say you should be empathetic. It doesn't work. But if somebody is bringing this up in therapy, or they brought it up to you, Paula, there's something not working for them with it. There's something not working. That's why they brought it up.
Right.
There's some suffering there. There's some alienation.
Right.
There's some distance from hopes and dreams. And I think behind every cynic is an idealist wanting to come out. And so I try to tap that, but without telling them they're wrong. I mean, that's it's so hard to be consistent in this work, to not tell people they have to change attitudes that have to be that they have to discover they're changing. You can't make them.
No.
I also want to just mention, at the same time as I helped Braver Angels get started, I got started a group of police officers and Black men in Minneapolis. And of course, we're the epicenter of all this now. Along with a Black colleague of mine, we started this group, and talk about an empathy gap to be built. What that group came together because it's not working. Police and Black community are not, it's not been working. It's not ever been working. And how are we going to get past that, if we don't encounter each other more deeply? And so we spent the first number of meetings, we've been going now for several years, telling stories. Our earliest experience with police officers, with Black men, with white men, and eventually something came about where not only did the community members tell stories of their encounters with police, but police talked about traumatic experiences they had in the job. the babies that they tried to resuscitate and who died. And so a humanity came there. And then we worked on crafting something to do together because we had encountered each other at a deep level.
Bill, there must have been a period where it felt like nothing was happening. I mean, in terms of that empathy gap.
Oh, sure. What I tell people, if you're going to have a sustained project, is figure 6 months to a year before we know what we're going to do.
Mhm.
If we're going to do a deep dive.
Yeah.
And I just tell people that. And so don't join. And if you're the kind of person that says, hey, we've already met twice, and how come we haven't changed the world?
Uh-huh.
We have to be prepared if for deeper transformation, for a deep process.
Isaiah, what's your experience with that?
I will tell you from the perspective of a person who steps into every space that I do with a level of privilege that I have to acknowledge and check at the door. It positions philanthropy to operate different than it ever has before. So just talking from a leadership perspective, we come into the room with the financial resources to invest in problems. We often have a theory of change that we think we've already decided on. We come to our nonprofit partners or community stakeholders offering what we think the solution should be. And I think we've had to figure out how to move into a space where we're not fixing. And I think Bill may have said this earlier, the space where we're all on our own journey to discover our own truths, to listen to our own inner teacher, to be on our own inner journey, our own personal journey, while also working with other folks or navigating a room where everyone's trying to get to a place, but they're navigating one another to get there. And so what does it mean to create the container or the compassionate space that we can all offer what we believe are the contributions and then come out equally disappointed about how we're going to move, but knowing that we are. And to Bill's point, that takes time. And time is the one thing we don't have a lot of. We've got money. There are dollars that are floating around in our community. The one thing you don't have a lot of is time, especially when you're backed up against big issues. Like, again, we talked about political polarization. We talked about racial tensions building. We talked about a country that's divided. So everyone wants the quick fix or the silver bullet. And I think there's going to be a silver buckshot that's going to help to address many of these problems. And we're going to have to figure out how collectively we decide when to pull the trigger on that silver buckshot. That way everyone feels like they have agency in the decisions or in the process or in the outcomes or in the impact. And I think that is the process that we're building right now. I think that's why the work that you're doing, really talking about the higher ground that we all have to be called to land on, is important, because we're not going to be able to go out with these silver bullet solutions that individual groups, organizations, or even sectors come up with. We're going to have to really do some cross collaboration to get there. And it's going to require us thinking about ourselves, our own lived experiences, while also acknowledging the lived experiences of those folks that we're needing to partner with.
Yeah, beautiful. And for me, it's developmental. This is again like therapy, Maureen. It's developmental. It's not immediately transformational. One of the things I worry about now in our conversation about dismantling racism, I'm like, really? Like next year, we're going to like dismantle it and rebuild something else? And it can create expectations for immediate transformational change that will leave people disappointed and cynical. It's got to be developmental, in my opinion.
And Bill, to your point, we are talking about dismantling systems that were built on systems of inequity. So it's not just going to be one, it's going to be this is a massive undertaking. We're talking about a tectonic shift. We're talking about really changing the way we engage with one another, the way we engage with systems. If you think about police officers, what do you do when peacekeepers aren't keeping the peace for everyone? Well, you also have to acknowledge that system is still needed real time to protect peace for the folks that they are. I mean, those are really big issues, and we're talking about people.
Right.
We're talking about people that are doing real work day in. They wake up every day and go to sleep every night thinking about how to protect the community they live in or they care about. They have a mandate to do that work. And we're saying, listen, you're doing it in a lot of places, but there are some spaces where you aren't doing it well. What does it mean to interrogate that system in a way that we offer some empathy for the spaces that exist, while also not being tolerant of the negative or bad behaviors that exist within the system? That's a tough conversation, not only to navigate, but to facilitate. Who is the person to facilitate that conversation that doesn't come with a strong position? How do we figure out those spaces? I think, Bill, you're probably the one to navigate the conversation. I appreciate you. But this skill set is really hard.
Hardest stuff I've ever done.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. How do we help everybody involved retain their humanity and their dignity?
Yeah.
Because without that, we're never going to go forward. So I'm thinking about a Black officer in my group who knows that history, who sued the police department successfully some years ago for racial discrimination. And he believes, and he said publicly, that policing is an honorable profession. It's an honorable profession. How to hold that together?
Yeah, I mean, how do you acknowledge, and it exists across, so we can talk about policing, we can talk about, but how do I acknowledge the unconscious bias that I have, the unconscious homophobia that I bring to a conversation? I love people of all diverse backgrounds, but I bring some unconscious bias around homophobia because of the way I was raised in the churches that I was raised in, right? I bring that. How do I acknowledge and check that as I'm engaging with folks, and also acknowledge that that isn't my best self, but it is part of Isaiah when I come to the table? How to acknowledge the inner racism and the unconscious bias that I have about people that look like me when I'm entering to a space and having conversations, acknowledging that that's not the best part of Isaiah, but it is me and it needs to be checked at the table. And how do we all do that? How do we acknowledge the privileges that we have, earned privileges and unearned privileges? There's some things that I went to school. I did 4, 5, years in undergrad, right? I finished it. And I come with some privileges that piece of paper offers me. But then there's some unconscious privileges. some unearned privileges that I have, like being a male. What does it mean when I'm a man in the room with a room full of women, right? There's some privileges that come that I didn't earn. I didn't earn being a man. I hit a lottery that landed on me being a guy and not a gal, right? What does that mean? And what does it mean when I don't acknowledge that privilege in the room?
We could go on for another hour.
Right.
So I'm completely with you, Isaiah. And here's my pushback. If people don't feel that, if they don't experience that themselves, if I push that on them, I turn them away. People have to discover, and they have to come to. And so I work in the red-blue area, and blues liberals say those things. I agree with everything you said, and the language itself is a turnoff to lots of others. And how do we navigate that, as opposed to me saying to you, if you don't agree with me, you're unenlightened, my friend, and my job is to enlighten you. And I know that's not your approach.
No, yeah,
but that's what happens in those conversations, and then conservatives feel like their dignity is being taken away from them. So how do we? It's hard to march forward.
So Bill, I'll give you one quick thing, and I know Paula's going to kill us in a minute here. But one of my staff members will remind us, and often reminds me, because I move really fast and I'm always on one thing onto the next. It's like, Isaiah, use all of the words, communicate every piece of what you're trying to say. That way I can get all of it. Because when you just say the one piece, I'm getting the top layer. I need all of it. I need the depth. I think the other thing is that eliminates some of the triggers, right? When I have to use all of the words, I don't just get to say homophobia. I get to talk about the lived experience. I get to explain how I got to this place. And you better understand how I got there. So you're not caught up on the trigger word or whatever that is. You're really being thoughtful about everything that I'm saying. I think there's this other part, and I would just go back full circle to maybe the first thing I said here when I heard Maureen talking. Leadership is the art of disappointing your people at a rate they can absorb. And I think that is the facilitation that has to happen. That's the level of facilitation. You can't push people so far away that you push them off the cliff, but you got to push them just far enough that you get them to move on to something different, or at least hear something different than they have before. And that's an art. And I think, Bill, you described it in a number of ways. And at the macro level, I think Maureen's doing it at an individual level. I'm trying to do it as an organizer between systems. But it's a thing that you just keep learning over and over again, and you continue to explore and you get better at it. And hopefully our country or our local communities get better as a result of us kind of practicing that.
I'm so sorry to have to bring this conversation to a close.
But that was a great ending. He nailed Isaiah, nailed the ending.
No.
Yeah.
No, I do want to give each of you a chance to say one more thing before we close, because we're talking about a lot of really hard, complex issues that require patience and endurance and vulnerability and wonder and deep listening. But all three of you are doing really hard work. And I'm wondering, what gives you hope? What inspires you? What can you offer us as we move forward on our journey. And Maureen, I'm going to ask you to get us started.
Okay. I was thankful for this question because it helped me look backward and evaluate kind of how I did during the height of the pandemic. And I think continuing to work was very helpful for me. And while it was, intense and difficult at times, I really felt like I had a front row seat at watching people do some amazing things and being very resilient. And so that was encouraging every day. Another thing that has been helpful for me and informative for me is I belong to an ecumenical group that's combined with Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox members, and Protestants. And the purpose of the group is to learn from each other about the different facets of Christianity. And conversations are all about finer points of theology, but also about our lived experience of our own faith walk. And that organization, because I've actually been able to be a part of and witness people coming from very different backgrounds and very different perspectives about something that's extremely important to them. And I've been able to be a part of watching them do that with love and openness, and change happens. And so that experience has really informed me that this is possible. And then one last thing, the other thing that group has done for me is that it has helped give me a historical perspective. So one of the things that we would talk about is, what has been the history? How did the church respond to other pandemics? What have human beings done historically in situations like this? And so that was just really gave me a larger perspective, and actually a more hopeful perspective.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Isaiah, what gives you hope?
Now, one, just being on calls like this one, where I really get to explore the understanding and the lived experiences of folks that are doing this work across the country. So thank you for this opportunity. I'll also be pretty quick in this because I've talked quite a bit throughout this process.
Great.
One thing that I'll say as we're in summer, let's talk about summer solstice, right? In summer, this year we celebrated Juneteenth for the first time as a national holiday. We also celebrate the 4th of July. And for me, I find some hope in the potential of this country. It's two dynamic tensions for me to wrestle with. One, I see so many marginalized communities that happen to be communities of color, or people that have lived experiences similar to the ones that I have, that don't have opportunity. But I think there's also this belief, or this actually common understanding, that it's only in a country like this one that I can be president and CEO of a $277 million community foundation with the types of resources and access and privileges that come from the space. It's only in a country like this one that can have this opportunity. Two dynamic tensions, right? In one case, there's power and influence and the opportunity and the authority to kind of move things and make things happen in the local community, while also acknowledging in the broader country, there's still challenges to wrestle with. And those two tensions are things that I wrestle with all the time. What does it mean to live in the space of privilege that I have the opportunity to, because of the investments or the sacrifices of an amazing mom and aunt that I told you about earlier, and family members, and quite frankly, a generation of civil rights leaders before me, right? I get this opportunity while also acknowledging that there are so many that don't have it. Mm-hmm. And so that gives me great hope that we can, as a country, maybe live into the promise of the flag, live into the promise of the many symbols that we have that suggest that we're going to be a place where people can live in to all of the potential that they have in making this community a better place. And so thank you for the opportunity. And I tell you, that's the one thing that gives me hope.
Thank you. Bill, bring us home.
You're making me follow Isaiah. I mean, the guy is biblical. Okay. So I will be brief and say that, and as I noticed your religious background, that for me, God is relational, and it's about, my hope is in relationships. We are wired for relationships with one another. We occupy this planet together. I believe in a kind of divine spark in all of us. So that's number one, that gives me hope. It's a faith. And then the second is one of my favorite quotes from a politician that goes this way: "We all do better when we all do better."
Hmm.
So that gives me hope.
What a
Yeah.
perfect way for us to end. Thank you all so much for this rich, stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.